Welcome back to Razmafzar TV. Today I have Beat back here. Hi Beat, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
We are going to talk about another archery manual. We worked on it, and this is a very interesting because this manual consists of different parts, also about wrestling, about spear fighting, about sword sharpening. But that's not what we are going to discuss. Also about riding. What we are going to discuss in our tradition, which we have been talking together, is about the art on the part on archery. Okay, Beat, let's go ahead. What is this manuscript all about?
Well, it's by Šarif Mohammad. Obviously, Šarif means a descendant of the Prophet, I think. He was the son of Ahmad Mehdi Hosseyni, and the period is from the reign of Šāh Esmā'il Safavid I, so the founder of the Safavid dynasty. So we're looking at between 1502 to 1524 in the Common Era. So this was probably the last great flowering of Persian military archery. I mean, it survived for centuries after this, but this is when it was really effective on the battlefield. So the book is a bit strange. I say this every time we work on one of these manuscripts because everyone is unique. And this one, I know when you translated it and we were working through it, we noticed that in some places he talks about the first part, the second part, the third part. Well, actually, he doesn't mention the second part. That's just completely forgotten. Fourth part. And then he starts talking about the sixth chapter, seventh chapter. I honestly don't know whether this is an unrevised manuscript or it's a compilation of two manuscripts by the same guy. It's not huge. It's not a giant thing, but it's full of fairly deep technical information. The original manuscript is in the National Library of Malek in Tehran. And as you said, it covers a lot of military topics, and archery is just one of them. And he says, in the first part, concerning the principles of archery, when grasping the bow grip and drawing fully, locking, aiming at the target, releasing and pausing, which really should be the other way around, pausing and releasing. Or actually, the way it comes out, it may mean pausing a bit before shooting with a hard bow. And he refers to unrestricted or not formal shooting, grouping, which in Arabic is jam, which is incredibly important in archery, which is the ability to get all your arrows to land in a specific area. Even if it's not what you're aiming at, if they're all landing in the right place, your only problem is where you're pointing the bow, not your release or anything else. Holding a shield, which I must admit, having shot holding a shield is a lot of fun, but to actually work out the movement so that the shield protects you when you're not shooting rather than just getting in the way. Because a shield, like a typical Persian shield in battle, as opposed to fencing when you're using the little ones, is quite big. It's half a meter, 54 centimeters maybe. And that's good when you're fighting hand to hand, but it's not much protection if you're on the battlefield and someone's shooting arrows at you, because the lower half of your body is going to be exposed. So if you're behind a low wall or something, you might be okay. And he also talks about he should know how to perform archery with a shield, in armor, and when wearing a helmet. And he knows the science of his weapon as well as the relationship between some weapons and others. Basically, one of the other manuscripts talked about the great advantage of how far away you can be from somebody and hit them. So therefore, if you're fighting hand to hand, well, you've got no advantage because you're within reach of the other person. If you're fighting with swords, you're a bit further away. If you're fighting with spears, you're a bit further away. But if you're fighting with a bow, you're a lot further away and you have a lot of advantages. And that's the science of this weapon. There's also suggestions in here that the author understood in fair detail the ballistics of arrows. It's not gone into enough detail for us to know for sure, but he really does. There's this implication here that there's a lot of background in what this particular author knows about. When he first talks about the principle of archery and then the branches of archery, and in something like Taibuka's book, this is extensively discussed, and Arab archery, Abu Maimun's book, same thing. So the long tradition of writing about archery was, fundamentals. In Arabic, one of the terms is usul, the pillars of archery, and this is right there. And this is 1520s or whatever. The tradition is still alive and well. They haven't lost that background knowledge, which is important, I think. He does quote one of the very famous things that almost everybody disagrees with, which is, keep your left hand strong and the target should be hidden behind the fist. This is, you've got your bow there, you've got your target hidden behind the fist. This is about the worst possible thing that could happen to you, because if you're shooting against somebody who can shoot back at you, you can't see what they're doing. So you don't know whether to duck. And many authors quote this and then completely discount it because they said, well, A, it only happens at one distance. It actually happens at two distances, but basically it's a single point thing. And two, you can't see your enemy, so you can't defend against your enemy. So when you're in battle, you have two things. You've got to be able to attack your enemy and defend yourself. If you can only do one of them, you're ineffective. If you can't defend yourself, you get killed. If you can't attack your enemy, he doesn't care because you're not a threat. In the branches of archery, which I'm not really sure whether that's what he really means, he said the hands should be placed on the bow elegantly and well so the arrow reaches the target easily. And another thing to note is he should know the size of his bow and his bowstring and the length of his arrow and know whether its thickness or thinness is appropriate. Basically, know your equipment. Not just, this is my bow, but how big is my bow? What kind of arrow goes with my bow? This machine here is to measure the stiffness of an arrow. So you put a weight on the arrow and it measures how much the arrow bends. The more it bends, the lighter the bow you can use it with. You can use a stiff arrow with a light bow. It'll just shoot off to the right if you're using a thumb draw. But if you use a weak arrow with a stiff bow, you don't know what it's going to do because it flexes too much and it might end up going off that way or going off that way. If it's moderately light, generally it'll just go to the left a bit. But if it's too light, it flexes so much it can break. If you've got very good technique, you won't break it, but you won't be able to control where it's going to go. So this, right at the beginning, he tells you something vital. So it jumps from the first part to the third part. When I was working this out, when I wrote notes on this, so I'd know where I'm up to. I went back over this and I couldn't find the second part. I have no idea. I would say that the third part is really the fourth part, but you can't really rewrite his words. And the third part, whatever it is about the size of the arrow. And then I'm thinking when I first read this, he's talking about long arrows and short arrows. And the first thing he says about the short arrow, and then he says the flight shooting arrow. He's not talking about a short arrow in the sense of a Turkish flight shooting arrow, which is considerably shorter, like 10, maybe 6 to 10 centimeters shorter than your regular arrow. But he's talking about a similar kind of thing. He says the flight shooting arrow consists of 35 parts. What he's saying is you take your arrow, here's an arrow, divide it into 35 equal parts. Doesn't matter what length your arrow is, divided in 35 equal parts. Turkish flight arrows were divided into 24 equal parts.
Oh, really? Okay.
So this is a consistent thing within the archery world. And he says, in the flight shooting arrow, it's 35 parts. And originally this might have meant 35 finger widths or something like that. But by this stage, it's just a ratio. And he says there's an arrow called the morning arrow, which we never quite worked out what that meant. We know what the words mean, but we don't know what the arrow is. But technically, you can work some things out. He says the feathers of the morning arrow should be 10 parts. That's 10 parts of 35. And from this, the feather of the tirihaki should be 5 parts. And the feathers of the throwing arrow should be 1 part. We're not quite sure. We think that might mean a dart, like a dart for an arrow guide. Should be 1 part. So if an arrow, say the arrow is, for ease of subdivision, 70 centimeters long. If you divide it into 35 parts, each part is 2 centimeters, which weirdly enough is roughly the width of a finger. And therefore he's saying that the morning arrow should be 10 parts, which would be 20 centimeters. The tirihaki should be 5 parts, which is 10 centimeters, 4 inches in imperial. And the throwing arrow should be 1 part. So 2 centimeters long. I think I've got a ruler here somewhere. And that's really short, right? So from my thumb to the tip of this ruler is 2 centimeters.
Yeah.
This is a very short feather. The feathers on this are 12 centimeters long, which would be 6 in his measurement.
Why is it so short, B?
Sorry?
Why is it so short?
Because the throwing arrow may be just a dart for a majra, for a navak, in which case the arrow itself is only that long. So therefore, that's a reasonable length. The khaki, we know from the other manuscripts, that's for shooting extreme long distance targets, where they put a layer of dust, hak, on top of the target because you can't see the arrow in the target, but you can see it hit because the dust flares up. Now he says the feathers of the forwarding arrow, which in Persian, in Farsi, is tiri pishrol, should be 2 parts, which is 4 centimeters, which is roughly 1 5/8 inches. Now, there is a Turkish arrow called Pisrev, which is written the same in Ottoman Turkish as in Farsi. And that's the flight arrow. That's the top level flight arrow for competition shooting. And that length of fletching is almost precisely the same as what actual Turkish flight arrows have. So we're looking at something that is very, very, very close to Turkish practice of roughly the same time. So we're looking at not a, I mean, there's a lot of Persian traditions in this, but there are some things that seem to be fairly international. Flight shooting is one of them. He says that there is one part I can't understand. He says one should fletch an arrow in such a way that it resembles the feathers on a hen. And I don't know whether he means 2 wings and a tail, so 3 fletching. I just don't know. I can't work it out. An arrow should have three features. One is lowness, the second is going far, and the third is hardness. So the features are pretty much broadly divided. You've got lowness, I think, refers to the lowness of the fletching, but it could actually mean to the flatness of the trajectory of the arrow when you shoot it to. Don't know. Going far, well, you want long range with your arrow. I mean, a heavily fletched arrow is not going to go far. We had special arrows, flu-flus, specifically so they don't go too far when you shoot things in the air, so you don't have to walk too far to pick them up. And hardness, and I think he's talking about this, stiffness of the arrow. So you can shoot a stiff arrow out of a soft bow and a hard bow, but it's much harder to shoot a soft arrow out of a stiff bow than it is in reverse. And he recommends poplar and reed. Now, poplar was a munitions grade arrow wood in say England or northern India for that matter. Mubarak Shah, I think, refers to poplar as very popular in Central Asia, but we use reed here because it's better. And to be honest, the reed from the whole Indian subcontinent is much better than reed from many other places. It was exported, it was that good. We in the notes, we went into some details about the measurements, referring them back to things like Saracen archery and other things like that. So a finger is defined in Saracen archery, where Latham and Patterson did a lot of research onto measurement, and it would be a shame to waste it, as 2.078 centimeters. And that meant a 33 finger arrow would be 68.574 centimeters, which is roughly 27 inches. And there's more discussion of this, but what you get from this is that in all probability, the original people reading this would have had a very precise idea. When he said 30, 35 sections long, he was probably talking about 35 fingers. Now, normally you'd say 4 fingers is the width of a fist. So 35 is 8 and a bit fists. We come later on to things in this that suggest that it's in that range. But without getting too tied up in the detail of the measurement, because there's a lot of arguments you can have about it, I think we should move on. His next section is about the deficiencies of arrows. And this is actually one of those technical bits in this that's quite interesting. I mean, sometimes these manuscripts are very, very vague or very general, and he starts out that way. One of the deficiencies of an arrow is when the arrow is short. The other is when the arrow is long. And the wood of the arrow is soft and the wood of the arrow is too hard. And an arrow shaft which has a crack and an arrow shaft which is wide, or when it's thin. What he's saying is you don't want one that's too short, too long, too wide, too soft, too strong. This is a real standard way of describing this. They don't say you want an arrow that's pretty much in the middle of all these things. They say you don't want one that's too soft, you don't want one that's too hard, you don't want one that's too short, and the best arrow is the one that's between all these things. It's a general principle, but very difficult to pin down to anything. Then he goes into the characteristics of the arrowhead, which goes right out the window because it's things that we only have the vaguest idea of what he's talking about. So he said, one is sahar, which means dawn, which might be something to do with a morning arrow when you think about it, but who knows. One is kapar, which means to shed, or is shed, it falls off. Then there's Sabukul Gilani. Well, Gilan is a province just below the Caspian Sea. One is Changali Pekan Igari, which you worked out meant a forked arrowhead. We know they were used, so that's quite logical. And a type of arrowhead with a very rounded head, and its top is four-lobed, and it's good for piercing shields. This sounds like a bodkin that transitions into a round body. And it might be a bodkin that's strongly reinforced. So when you look at a Margie arrow, you have this very kind of blunt faceted point on a long steel neck that tapers down to where it meets the arrow. So that what it does is when it hits something, it punches a hole bigger than the arrow, so that the arrow will go deeply into whatever you shoot. An arrowhead that is very round and its length is equal to 1 finger. Now, does it mean 1 finger breadth or 1 finger length? It says the length of 1 finger. So we're talking about probably a long round arrowhead, which sounds very much like an Margie, is good for piercing armor. They make a tri-lobed, 3-faced arrowhead, and this is good for piercing Joshan, the breast armor, the breastplate armor, which could be lamellar or plate and mail or whatever. Eugocidas cuirass, which I think is the most correct way of terming, and then zere, male. Another thing to note is they make a long arrow with a rounded head, and this is good for piercing male armor. The arrow in the shape of a small nail is good for piercing shields made of hide and wood. Now, a small nail could refer to a small bodkin point. Nails weren't necessarily round like they are now, because nails now are made from wire, and the wire goes into a thing and it gets flattened and gets a head. But in the old days, nails were hammered out, and they often, or most normally, were either square in cross section or rectangular. And I think this is what he's talking about here. Then he gets on to the characteristics of the bow. This is the fourth part. And he says, for shooting the tiri haki, one should use a narrow and short bow, such as a bow of Kerman. Kerman's a city. And a bow of Igi, which we don't really know what that means. And similar to these are used with the male armor arrow and the tiri sahar, which is the dawn arrow. They should be used with a strongly curved bow, such as the bow of the plateau or the bow of Ardane, which is another place. Now, what he's saying here, we know from other manuscripts that the tiri haki is a long distance target arrow. So what you would want for that is a stable bow with a very fast return, which is like a cross between a flight bow and a target bow. So narrow and short. Flight bows are generally shorter than ordinary bows, and narrow implies it doesn't get its strength from the width of the limb, but from the depth, which is more efficient if you want to get more speed out, because the strength varies with the directly with the width of a bending object, but with the cube of the depth of an object that you're bending. So this is all perfectly logical in physical terms. For flight shooting arrow, one should use a short bow, which we've already said, with a length of 9 fists. Now, we thought about this, length of 9 fists, that's a really short bow. That's shorter than any bow that we ever have seen that wasn't on a crossbow. So what he's probably saying is that the flight shooting arrow, one should use with a short bow, and the length of the flight shooting arrow is 9 fists. Because that would make perfect sense. Because have a look, 1 fist, 2 fists, 3 fists, 4 fists, 5 fists, 6 fists, 7 fists, 8 fists, 9 fists. So that's not unreasonably short. But if that was a bow, could you imagine a bow that was from here to there? You couldn't. I've got a steel bow like that,
Yeah.
but it's just not efficient. So what we're dealing with in these translations is sometimes it's difficult to tell where one clause starts and another one ends, or whether the piece in the middle is referencing the first part of the sentence or the second part of the sentence, because it's not clear. It would have been clear if someone was talking to you, but when you write it down, it doesn't make too much sense. And there's the final part of this section is, but the Damascus bow, Kamani Dimashq, should not be wet, but in warm places it gets rigid. I think this means that Damascus bows are no good if they get damp, so if you're in high humidity. But if it gets really dry, like in the desert, they become much stiffer than they normally are, which tends to suggest that their coatings are porous and they let moisture in and out. He doesn't say they're no good. He's just saying, just be careful with these bows. So the fifth part, which is labeled as the fifth part, is about the characteristics of grasping the bow. He says in general terms the grasp should be between the proximal and middle joints. I think he's talking about these joints here. So that's the proximal joint, the joint being the bending part. In Australian English, we often use joint to mean the phalanx. And I've noticed in some translations that happens in other languages too. So there's a bit of ambiguity, but it's clear what he's talking about. Now, what he means is not that the bow is sitting way up here, like, I'll try not to do anything dangerous here. The bow is sitting way up there. What he's talking about is that the middle of the back of the bow is somewhere between there and there. And which is totally consistent. The three great masters varied. One had the center of the back of the bow here, one had it there, and one had it there. So that covers the complete range.